All right. So, as Barbara said, this is just like a real cursory overview, and I'm really looking forward to hearing comments and reflections from folks who are on the tour. So we started off on our first day, that first Monday, with first, sort of an overview from EASPD on how the European Union kind of plays a role and what their sort of what their structure is about. We talked about how the EU will propose, as it says, legislation and strategies, and but that there is sort of this cooperative sort of relationship between the EU and its member countries. And it is obviously the countries that implement, the direction and the recommendations of the European Union. As it says here, the EU is not a federal state. The system is decentralized and based on cooperation. So it was really interesting, I know, for me to kind of have a better understanding of what that relationship is like. Where does the EU set policy versus where do individual nations kind of establish their laws and such. And we had a chance to talk about that in a deeper dive later in the week. And that's more information that we'll share as we build out this presentation. What was, I think, of particular interest is how the country is split. As Barbara referenced, the northern part of the country is Flemish. It's Dutch speaking, and in some areas, it's very Dutch centric, if you will. The southern part of the country is Wallonian and French speaking. Their systems operate very differently. We'll talk in a minute about how in the Flemish part of the country, they have recently moved to a personal budgeting system for people and services, where people are their sort of level of need is assessed and determined once in their life, not every 3 years, not every 5 years, but one level setting determination. And a monetary award, if you will, is assigned to the assessed need, and that follows the person through their life. Now, there are processes where the individual can request a change if they have a change in acuity, if they have an illness or some other life-changing event. There is the way to seek additional support. But it is, I think, with a recognition that generally speaking, people who have IDD, their needs don't necessarily improve over time. Um, and then what they talked about is how the region of Belgium is different from both the North and the South. It's very EU centric. They oftentimes refer to it as the EU bubble or the Brussels bubble, where um, they are more, I guess, I don't want to say metropolitan. I don't know if someone has a better descriptor for it, but the sort of the culture, the languages are much more, again, metropolitan is just sort of what comes to mind. So on day one, well, let me stop there and see if anyone has any reflections on sort of that very high level overview.
Not for me. I think you did a good job.
Okay, great. So day one we spent in Brussels. As I mentioned, we met with officials from the Flemish Agency for Persons with Disabilities. They walked through their system of resource allocation, again, using our language. That's not exactly how they refer to it, but those folks really talked about this system. It's newer in implementation, and people have the ability to organize and purchase the services they want with an annualized budget. Following that, we traveled to the Saint-Gilles section of Brussels and met with one of the, essentially a town council member. It's sort of that equivalent who spoke to us about the community there, services for folks there. And we had a chance to meet with people from UB, the Hubie Support Center. They're like a day, sort of like a day service provider. And they talked a little bit about some of the struggles of implementing this personalized budgeting system. I'll stop there, see if anyone has thoughts or comments on meeting either with the counselor and Sanjil or with the Flemish state employee.
I'd like to just jump in really quickly. So, so how Flanders does the personal budgets was frankly the most interesting thing to me of the entire study tour. We learned, and that's why I really want us to elaborate on a lot more in, the formal presentation to Anchor membership. Uh, they explained to us that the government there is a liberal government, and not, and they define that as more free market as opposed to sort of our idea of what liberals is. And so with the personal budgets, it really put people in control in terms of kind of they could purchase what they wanted. They learned, they've had it up and running for a while, and there are some problems, and they're already in the middle of they're already starting to evaluate and really fine tool it more. But I'd love to hear what a couple of other people thought about that.
Yeah, Barbara, I agree that the personal budget to me was the most interesting, obviously, because it's a hot topic in a lot of states across, back here home, as that's already happening in many locations. I guess more than anything, what was a little bit cathartic about it or therapeutic about it was that although the system sounds great, much of what they echoed were the same types of challenges that we faced, right? That although the personal budget system sounds great and it's in place and people can buy, there is an extensive waiting list in order to enroll in it, which could be many years long. So that was quite restrictive. So you can definitely see no different than here when we met with the Flemish Agency for Persons with Disabilities. Although they did acknowledge a wait list, they obviously put their positive tone on it and feeling about what the program was about. And I think it's actually due for a refresh or a strategic look is what they're doing now to change it a little bit. Um, but I like the concept. Have always liked the concept of what they describe as liberals. We define as free market. The ability for people to choose the services they want and where they want and who they want to provide it, and also the need for providers there to change their mindset to a real business mentality, a much more capitalistic mindset, and how you have to pivot as an organization and a business to survive, everything from the quality of your services to your marketing and outreach and to being business efficient in so terms. So it's something that I'm very interested in. I think it's obviously a huge topic for Anchor going forward here in the States.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I think that is spot on. Rita?
Yeah, what I would add to that is what I thought was interesting in this was they were very open in saying it's costing them more than what they anticipated it would cost them. So much of the same conversation that we have as we talk about self-directed, which to me, that's kind of what I equivalate it to here in the States, the self-direction, but not just self-directed around I get to choose my services, but the whole fiscal management side of it, right? Where there's the money goes into a pot and that's the money I have to spend. So, they mentioned that the system was costing more than they thought. They talked about how people have a disability, but they might have a suspected disability, which was a unique concept about you didn't have to prove you had a disability. And so that traditionally went into this program too. And then we asked the question about what happens if somebody overspends. It kind of was a stronger position than what we have traditionally, at least in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where I've been involved with self-directed, where it's like, okay, we'll figure this out. You might get a few more units, blah, blah, blah. We'll figure it out. They were very much about, hey, you had this pot of money to manage, and that's the pot of money you manage. So, who knows what happens behind the scene, but they were pretty adamant about that side of it and the accountability of the person or the family managing that. But this wasn't the end all be all for everyone either, because they also talked in great detail about their voucher program, which felt much more like how residential was dealt with for people with more severe disabilities, direct payment to the provider versus a personal budget. So what struck me about this is the more we thought we might be different, there's a lot of similarities too, but still things to learn from each other.
Yeah, and I think also the just what's different, obviously, than us is the overall umbrella over the entire system, which is socialized medicine, socialized healthcare, as well as, I guess, if you compare it to our SSI, SSD system, their system there, and higher education and all those things, which is like there's not as much conversation there about obviously Medicaid and healthcare are dominating our airwaves now. Not much of didn't seem like to be much of a topic amongst people with disabilities there in the organizations because it's so much just a cultural assumption that everybody gets health care and some sort of social security type payment to help them.
Yeah. Yeah. Erica?
So, good morning, everyone. As they were talking about the personal budget, I kept wondering whether or not, as we are across the country here, sometimes describing a version of the same thing. And so a lot of what they described seemed like a version of the same thing that we have when we think about Children's Choice, for instance. It is a budget that a person gets to decide how they want to spend it for the year, and they can spend it on whatever they choose. And it runs out. I think there are some measures by which you can request an emergency for something else if you go beyond your budget. Also, it seems the level of care that we often assign based on CIS assessments or whatever a state uses to gather a level of care in some ways correlates to a budget to some degree. And our individuals then select the services that they want to utilize those that allotment on. So some of it sounded the same. How they go about giving the budget seems to be a little bit different, but it seemed again in some ways just very much a take on some of what we already do to some degree across the programs, just worded a little bit differently. And they seem to have fewer regulations. And I think that when we saw the CIS assessment and those things come out, they were very generous in assigning levels, and that system costed a lot more than what they anticipated. It had the pretty much the opposite effect. And then we know that self-direction always costs more because they have just ultimate choice in pay and everything, and so they wind up often paying more for their workers and less on the services that are going to be provided. So that was kind of my take on it. It does sound like a lot of what we already do in some way or form.
Thanks, Erica. Okay, let's move on. So Tuesday, we traveled to Antwerp. We met with an organization called Emino, and they are also very sort of centered on employment types of services. This was a difficult organization to really sort of connect with. They broke us into groups and had two smaller presentations, and one of which was a program that they were very proud of. It was focused on helping cancer survivors and people undergoing treatment re-enter the workforce, but it really felt kind of disconnected from what we were hoping to hear about. Lovely people. We spent the day at their location, but This was probably our least impactful visit. And then later that day, we met. I cannot even try to say that word, but we met with an organization that provides in-school support services for children with IDD and other disabilities. That was really interesting. So we learned a little bit about the educational system. And it was interesting to learn about these learning centers, and there are a number of them across the Flemish part of the country that provide this like in-class support, almost like I likened it almost to like teacher aides, that we, as we would think of them. So with that, let me see. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, but let me see if anyone has some additional comments regarding M&O or the school-based supports.
Yeah, what I would add here is the school-based supports. I was actually really surprised that they have so many specialty schools, that they are not an inclusive society for education. And that's from early childhood on up. That actually kind of surprised me. But I would say the Learning Support Center, I don't know about other states, it might be similar, but in Minnesota, we have regional support spaces where OT, PT, speech therapy, all those kinds of things then get dispersed out to the school systems for the support. I kind of equalized this, and I went up and chatted with one of the ladies afterward and asked about inclusion, and had shared that, 20 years ago when my daughter was in school, was the first year that Minnesota had inclusion, but from the time she was in first grade on up, it was totally inclusive. And some of the different pieces about different levels of education and how that was for our experience. And she said, I wish we could get there. We'd love to learn from you guys because we are not at all inclusive. So that was really interesting to me, not what I expected.
Great. Thanks, Rita. I'm just going to jump ahead here, as I said, try to keep us to time. Wednesday, we went to the city of Ghent, which was beautiful, really, really breathtaking. But here we met with Connect Group, and this I think we would all agree was probably the most impactful organization we met with. They are doing some really tremendous out of the box, community-based education, access, community-based resources, and they have three parts of the organization. They have their primary program. They have what's called Connect Breakout, and that is focused specifically on youth in transition and helping them do some experiential learning to enter the workforce, and then it supports young people in finding and keeping employment. And then they have this creative arts center called Platform K, where it is a fully inclusive dance and theater group. And we got to see some snips from some of their performances. And what really resonated for me anyway was their focus on no exclusion, no separation, no discrimination, and no keeping people small. I noted that when we were in the session with them, they kept referring to no keeping people small. They were wonderful and engaging, and I don't know if anyone else has a comment about Connect.
I was one of the favorite things that we saw. Really true integration, true inclusion in action.
Agreed. I couldn't agree more. Your comments, Dawn, resonate with exactly how I felt about this piece
Yeah.
of.
I'll third that. And I think that's also where it seems like the personal budgets really came to life in a way, and the things that they were able to accomplish with individuals. And I love it specifically when they were talking about the young gentleman who is a professional dancer at this point, is in their dance program. I guess I want to say they didn't lower expectations, and maybe that is what they meant by not keeping people small. It was just because the individual had a disability didn't mean that they were going to lower the expectations into the quality and the method in which he needed to dance to be part of a professional group.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that we really saw for the first time where they were attempting to focus on transitioning youth, and kind of keeping people from falling off the cliff, because we did not get a lot of information around that, but it seemed like once you were out of the school system that possibly your opportunities were limited and you could go to what they call a daycare center. So, yeah, so I found that pretty interesting.
Right. Thanks, everyone. On Thursday, we stayed in Brussels. We spent the first part of our working time at EASPD at their offices with their staff. Thomas did a deeper dive overview into sort of the structure of the EU and how it really sort of intersects and integrates with the European countries. And then we also had a chance to meet with a gentleman who is essentially the director for the Employee Labor Union. It is a national labor union. It reminded me of the structure in Vancouver, Canada. For those of you who may be familiar with it, there is sort of this national union and works with the country and with the employers on labor practices. So they don't negotiate pay rates. That varies, but they work pretty assertively around working conditions, time off, those sorts of other labor-related matters. So that was pretty interesting. It would have been nice to have more time with that gentleman to really get a better sense of the work they do, how they sort of initiate this best practice, how they maintain it. But that was pretty interesting. And then we had a chance to visit the EU Parliament. We initially thought that we would have a chance to meet with some representatives in the disabilities sector from Parliament, but because of where the US kind of stands right now with regard to international relations, the people who were slotted to talk to us kind of on short order had to decline. No one sort of wants to be perceived as being on record talking with Americans around public policy. So that was,
And we would ask you to hold that. Kind of keep this in-house. It was sensitive.
yeah, it was sensitive. So apologies for that. Um,
No apologies. I would have shared the exact information, Donna. I just want folks to know. I mean, global and U.S. politics, had a small impact on our study tour. I think
mhm,
that is important information to communicate. We just don't want to make a big deal out of it.
yeah. And then on Friday, we met with a couple of different organizations. We started in Brussels and then later in the day traveled to Wallonia, which is the French-speaking part. In the morning, we met with a company called Unipso, and they are essentially an association for employers. So generally, the way these kinds of negotiations will work is you will have the state entity that is negotiating and interacting with this employer organization. And then the third leg of that stool is the one we just mentioned that this one here, the labor union rep. So it's a rep from the labor unions, a rep from the employer association, and the state that is sort of hammering out a lot of this policy. In the morning, we also met with a gentleman from AWITA, and I'd have to look up what that acronym stands for, but that's the association for specifically what we would call sheltered employment. Their sheltered employment is very different than ours. People are paid competitive wages. They are doing, in many cases, technical jobs. And the reach is far beyond folks with IDD. They have people with, acquired injuries later in life, people with physical disabilities. But they are, paid at, as I said, a competitive rate, and the work that people do is really sort of aligned, obviously, with their capacity. So some folks that have, stronger work histories, maybe doing more technical work, and folks that don't, maybe doing more of like the packaging processing kind of stuff that we tend to equate with sheltered employment. And then at the end of the day, we traveled into Wallonia in the southern part of the country and visited L'Atelier. And this is a picture of a gentleman, a couple of folks who were packaging chocolates on sort of a processing line. So they were very excited. He was trying to slip us some chocolate on the down low. But that was really interesting to see. And we had a chance to hear from a gentleman who served in this program, who works there, as a recipient, I guess, of this service structure, who seemed to have an acquired disability. And he spoke with us about the impact that this organization has had on his life. He's been able to maintain employment with competitive wages and still take care of his family. So that was really interesting. And then we wrapped up the tour on Saturday with a visit to an abbey in Dinant. And that abbey is currently occupied by, I think it's 18 monks who still brew beer and make cheese. And this was sort of off program, if you will, but it was a really nice experience. So I don't know if anyone has something to add about the conversations with UNIPSO or IWITA. Um, anything, any reflections there, folks? Barbara?
I would just say overall, oh my God, EASPD organized it so well. We walked out of there understanding kind of labor relations and, how all that. We walked out of there understanding special education. We walked out of there, understanding, the differences between the different countries, different parts of the country. What we didn't see enough of, I mean, what we really didn't see, and people correct me if I missed it, because, there but the next study tour that we put together, we really need to see how people with significant disabilities are supported, because we really didn't see that. But yeah, I mean, we heard about it, we just didn't see it. And I think they were incredible. I mean, they were as sensitive as they need to be. So that's kind of a difficult thing of like, how do you go see people? I mean, we didn't need to see, we just could have used more education around it as opposed to, kind of parading through organizations and programs or facilities that support people with significant disabilities. The other thing about the sheltered work is they over and over again, they called it modernized sheltered work, and for the reason that Donna mentioned, because everyone's earning minimum wage. But again, these were folks, who could, who didn't have significant support needs.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Barbara. That's the first thing I noticed, that we didn't see people with significant medical or challenging behaviors in the workforce or even in the mainstream in Belgium. And so the people that were in the sheltered workshop are people that would be employed with minimal job coaching here in the United States. They were extremely high functioning.
Mhm. I even think because of the way they define disability, so it just covers everything over there versus we're really focused on intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. They're it seemed like they were the exception versus the rule. And so it might be an understanding about how we define it and what was available to them for us to see. But I absolutely think the uniqueness between India and Belgium isn't just about how the countries handle things, but our expectations as what we were looking for in setting up the tours and what we saw based on maybe who managed it. I think, and you had one group where it was a provider group and families kind of managing the setup, and it was all about really getting into the core of here's what's happening and meeting people that they support. And this was a lot of policy and how things are set up and more of a generalized kind of thing. So I think it's just understanding the difference and what are we looking for in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that overview. It was really interesting to hear both directly from some of you and also in this discussion today. Any other comments before we move on with the agenda today?
I just want to be very express that I'm very grateful to the anchor team that went above and beyond in helping us to have a wonderful experience over there. Thank you, Donna, Gab, Barbara, the group. It was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Just a one note. We were doing 15-hour days. And apparently, Genevieve, I hear that's, what, the regiment of people in India, but boy, it was a lot. And certainly going forward, we got to build in a little bit more rest time because people were on the go from 7 o'clock in the morning until sometimes 11 o'clock at night. And 3 or 4 people went down, being sick during it. And so lessons learned.